Good evening. My name is Simon Godwin, and I am the Artistic Director of the Shakespeare Theatre Company in Washington, DC. Thank you for joining us for Shakespeare Hour Live. When we announced the extension of Shakespeare Hour Live several weeks ago, and in turn the plays that we would be discussing, we could not know that the tragedy of Othello would speak so much to the tragedy playing across America. The tragic and all too familiar news stories of racism, police brutality, and Black lives cut short by violence. In every household and workplace across America, people are having conversations about race and about how to talk about race. We are no exception. Our staff members have been internally sharing resources around equity, diversity, and inclusion. And this weekend, Shakespeare Theatre Company, along with many other theatres across America in New York and Washington, opened its doors as part of the Open Your Lobby campaign to share our space and resources with those marching and protesting in support of Black Lives Matter. And tonight, we discuss this fraught tragedy in a public forum. On the one hand, Othello is noble in spirit, a decorated war hero, a loving husband and well-respected by his peers. On the other hand, due to the insidious lies of Iago, Othello is reduced to a jealous, possessed, violent man, and he loses himself. That duality is one of the legacies of Othello. In his last speech before death by his own hand, Othello states, "Speak of me as I am, nothing extenuate, nor set down aught in malice." When we watch Othello in performance, we sit among strangers and ache for the many ways Othello and Desdemona and Michael Cassio, Emilia, even Iago are all undone and destroyed by the viciousness of hatred. We listen to these characters in their intimate moments as they share their desires, their anxieties, their truths, and we see ourselves. And when Shakespeare asked us to listen, to find ourselves, this is the legacy of this play as well. Boy, I really missed the theatre. So, even though we're in discussion tonight, we're also listening, especially me. Well, before I introduce our wonderful panelists this evening, I want to thank the generous sponsors of tonight's episode of Shakespeare Hour Live, Bonnie and Louis Cohen. Thank you. The Shakespeare Hour is produced as part of our larger artistic initiative, Shakespeare Everywhere, which is generously supported by the Beach Street Foundation. Now, let me introduce our wonderful guests. Actor Dion Johnstone, who STC audiences will remember from A Midsummer Night's Dream, and who played Othello at the Stratford Festival in Canada. Dion, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you. Thanks for having me aboard.
Thanks for being with us, Dion. It's great to see you. Can I ask where you are this evening?
I'm in Toronto, Canada, sitting in my office right now.
Wow, what a lovely office. Well, thank you very much. I love your plants.
Thank you.
I, of course, am in Rectortown Methodist Church Hall, where the internet is great. So my thanks to the Methodists for letting me take up residence in their wonderful space. And so welcome, Dion.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce, my great pleasure to introduce Tony Award-winning actor Liev Schreiber, who among his many, many credits, played Iago in the public theatre's production of Othello. Liev, are you there?
I'm here.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. I'm a little bit warm, but I'm well.
I don't have any plants, but there's a sewing machine over my right shoulder.
Right, interesting. So this is a kind of enigma for us to ponder over the next hour. Good. And can I ask where you are this evening?
I'm in Montauk, Long Island.
Oh, lovely. That's near the sea?
Yes, it's right on the sea. And
great. I'm slowly learning geography, geography of my newfound land.
Yes, it's the northeast tip. It's the tip of the continent. The tip of the United States. It's the easternmost point.
Okay, great.
Well, actually, that might not be true. I take that.
Well, I won't hold it. I won't hold you to it. But thank you. Great. Welcome, and thanks for being part of the show this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Finally, my friend. I'm so proud to call her a friend and colleague, director Whitney White, who we all. Hi, Whitney, who we all remember, of course, from directing the Amen Corner this winter, and who was the associate director for New York Theatre Workshop's 2016 production of Othello. Whitney, how are you?
I'm so good. I'm very, very happy to be spending a little virtual time with everybody on this in this group. It's actually a wonderful way to finish up the day.
Oh, well, thanks so much, Whitney. And just can I ask where you're talking to us from this evening?
I am in Chicago, Illinois, very near my family. I was in the midst of directing a production at Steppenwolf Theater when everything stopped, and so I stayed so I could be near my family, and I'm very happy about that.
Okay, so that's exciting. And actually, I should say, Whitney, that the set of the Amen Corner remains on stage at the City Harmon Hall where we stopped our run prematurely. It's still there. The ghost is still present. So let's hope we get back together one day.
Thank you. That was such a wonderful experience. Oh, that pains me a little bit to think of the set still on stage. Oh my gosh.
It's a testament to the spirit that remains. So now I need to turn over to Drew Lichtenberg, our resident dramaturg, to kick off the conversation about Othello this evening. Drew.
Thank you, Simon. I just want to say also how happy I am to be joined by our wonderful panel of guests. I also want to make a few just announcements before we get underway. We previously had announced Othello along with Much Ado About Nothing as part of a kind of conversation about marriage plays. But due to a number of factors, one of which is that our audience just wants us to focus on one play. They felt like we weren't devoting enough ample, rigorous time to our study of the texts that we thought it was appropriate to talk about Othello alone tonight, and also for the sort of tragic and maybe inspiring direction that our country's history has taken in the past 2 weeks. So we are talking about Much Ado at some point later in the summer. We promise we will get to it. I also want to let everyone watching at home know that there are 2 features that you should use as part of this webinar. There's a Q&A button if you want to ask any of us questions. I know Whitney personally asked for questions from our guests. And there is a chat button if you want to get rowdy in the chat room with comments for each other, or not rowdy, or safe, or whatever. Do what feels right to you. And that brings me to Othello, the play we're discussing tonight. There are many unique aspects to the dramaturgy of Othello, which make it stand out in Shakespeare's canon. Most obviously, there is Shakespeare's still controversial handling of race and the racial, or maybe the racist imagination. But there's also the unusual pattern that the play has in terms of the rest of the tragedies. Unlike those other plays, the movement of Othello is from the public realm increasingly to the private one. We move from Venice to Cyprus, eventually constricting all the way to Desdemona's and Othello's bedroom. So there is no kingdom at stake as there is in the rest of Shakespeare's tragedies. The public and the private seem to become inextricably tangled up and confused tragically in this play. So we thought we would nominally frame our conversation tonight in terms of love and hate. How do love and hatred displace one another, intertwine, specifically in the characters of Othello and Desdemona and Iago? So we thought, Dion, we would start maybe with you to kick us off.
Thanks, Drew. I think that these are great talking points, and in order for me to address them, I think I need to start by acknowledging your initial statement regarding the controversy surrounding the play's treatment of race and the racial imagination. Because when looking at Othello, especially in our present moment, I think it's important to examine the ways in which race and racial identity is entrenched in it. I mean, this play was written in the 1600s by a white man for a white English audience. And at that time, the role of Othello was never played by a black man. So you could say that this play in its conception was never intended for a black audience. And this, I believe, allowed for it to be a story that's more purely about love than how it gets displaced by hate. Because the original audience never saw a black man in the role, and they weren't literally confronted with their own perceptions of race. I mean, I imagine that it would make it easier to look at Othello in a humanistic light, a story where one could project their own pressures in life, or one could tap into their own understanding of what it's like to be an outsider. And the face of Othello, which at that time was played by a white actor in blackface, was just a mask, one in which the audience could project their own stories onto. But then 230 years later, when Ira Aldridge played Othello on London's Covent Garden stage, and for the first time an actual black man was seen in the role, the play was no longer an imagination of race. Suddenly, the white English audience had to confront their own fears of race and what they actually thought of Black people. The story itself became threatening. The violence in the play all of a sudden became real. Suddenly, Othello was no longer a mask in which the audience could project themselves onto. Now he was an actual being who wasn't like them, someone who in this light threatened them and the way their society was established. I think audiences were pulled out of the play at this point and the themes that it conveyed, because now all of a sudden they're asking questions like, what's a Black man even doing on the stage? How dare this man touch a white woman? How could someone whose society has already accepted as being subhuman, a slave, hold such authority and power in this world? It didn't compute. So Ira Aldridge's run, he was shut down after 2 performances. The reviews were terribly racist in their tone and language. He wasn't able to play any of London's biggest stages for the rest of his career. But he changed how we see the play. Over time, Black audiences now had access to this story, and their experience of viewing it brought a whole new set of questions and considerations. As a Black man, both having watched this play and having played the role of Othello, I've been confronted with many questions. You know, why does Othello risk his well-being by building a relationship with a white woman? For a star general who has such worldly experience, why doesn't he seem concerned about the consequences of being completely isolated in a white society? You know, when we talk about love in this play and the nature of Othello and Desdemona's love for each other, I find that Othello's testimony is really interesting. When he speaks to the Senate, he concludes by saying, "She loved me for the dangers I had passed, and I loved her that she did pity them." And this makes me wonder, how well does Othello see Desdemona? It sounds to me as if he sees himself idealized in her eyes, in the very way that he wants to be seen. And he loves her because she looks at him in that way. But he doesn't actually express what he sees and likes about Desdemona in and of herself. And this leads me to believe that he doesn't know her all that well. And in truth, their love is a young one. They haven't had time to really build a language and a history and an understanding based on experience. So I've always imagined that Michael Cassio plays a key role in Othello's life. Cassio, a well-educated Florentine, was kind of an inside man for Othello, an ally who Othello could trust to give information on the subtleties of courtship in Venetian society. And so Iago brilliantly removes this ally and then is able to take his place. And as we know, Iago then builds a case against Desdemona and by degrees supplants her as being the primary person whom Othello trusts. So the love of his wife and the establishment of his marriage all of a sudden is supplanted by this twisted version of the love of comradeship and loyalty and the commitment to doing what needs to be done no matter how painful the cost. I find it a really disturbing moment in the play. I believe this is Act 3, Scene 2, when Othello gets on his knees and says, "Now, by yon marble heaven, in the due reverence of a sacred vow, I here engage my words." And Iago asks him not to rise yet. And he gets on his knees and he joins him. And after pledging to commit his entire self to Othello's service, Othello says, "Now art thou my lieutenant." And Iago responds with, "I am your own forever." And it's with these words and this image of the two on the stage, on their knees, making a vow to each other that, to me, symbolically reminds me of a kind of a marriage. It's in this moment that we see Iago supplant Desdemona's position in Othello's heart. For Black audiences watching this play, this scene confronts our community's greatest fears. To be so blinded by the society that we're in, by the seemingly friendly voices that are whispering in our ears, that we could actually become oblivious to how we may be being used to sabotage ourselves. And we've seen that happen time and time again in our modern history. A tactic that's used by a white supremacist system to divide and conquer. Give a few Black people the power, uplift them so they feel special and accepted in this society, separate them from the rest of the Black populace so they no longer have a connection to their own community, but let them speak the message of the white agenda. Let them spread it to the Black populace to keep them in check, an action that ultimately is incredibly destructive to the advancement of Black people as a whole. I find that this makes for a really uncomfortable viewing of the play, but I think it's an unavoidable consequence of our history. And I think that we can't, especially when we look at what's happening right now, examine this play without examining those implications.
Wow, well, there are so many brilliant things to respond to, Dion, that you raise. One of which, I love this idea that Ira Aldridge kind of opens a hole in the play through which the last 300 years of history pour in and actually transforms the meaning of the play. And there's actually a great play by a playwright named Lalita Chakrabarti called Red Velvet that is about this production at Covent Garden of Othello, starring Ira Aldridge. And you also mentioned the scene in the exact midpoint of the play where Iago and Othello do swear a vow of fidelity to each other, almost in a pose straight out of the common law book of marriage. So yeah, love and hate, even though it's not as simple as mere love and hate, are at work in the play in a very, very complicated way. Liev, you have played Iago famously, and we were talking just before we went on air about how hard it is to think in terms of love and hate when you're approaching a character. So I'm interested to hear your response, maybe your process for exploring Iago doesn't break down on these simple lines.
Well, I think what's interesting about the idea of love and hate is that it encompasses the idea of antithesis, which for me is the beginning, middle, and end of how I approach Shakespearean characters. You can't have one without the other. I think for me, that defines Shakespeare as a writer, his use of antithesis, his use of duality, and his use of verse, obviously, in the prose. But I think that to speak to the race question for a second, and why I think Shakespeare is so remarkable, is that he couldn't help but write the other side of things. And for me, I guess in my imagination, that's an actor trying to write good speeches. He's trying to write good parts. He can't help but give the Jew, hath not a Jew senses of feelings, affections, feeling, if you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you prick us, do we not bleed? At an incredibly anti-Semitic time in Elizabethan England, when of course Marlowe's writing The Jew of Malta and you've got Barabbas, he can't resist these characters. He can't resist allowing Othello's and I would argue that Elizabethan England was a relatively racist and xenophobic period in history, but he can't help give Othello those speeches because I think he imagines himself saying them, and that's what was so remarkable about him as a writer. He would imagine himself saying them, and then he would imagine someone else saying them. But first and foremost, it feels to me like the kind of writer who imagined himself saying something. So when you read a part like Iago, and it just seems like the epitome of evil, and everybody tells you that's what it is, I think you have a responsibility to figure out that it's opposite. You owe the character the respect to figure out the other side of that antithetical concept, that you know, if everyone says Iago is full of insidious lies, if I were you, I would head into that play assuming that everything he says is the truth. Try playing that character under those circumstances and you'll come up with something remarkable, I think. I think at the very least what you'll reveal is that, you know, one of my favorite stories in Hinduism, in the Panchatantra stories, is about a guy whose wife was sick and she was dying. And he would go climb Mount Kailash every day to pray to Shiva to save his wife's life. And a few months in, of course, she is overwhelmed by the illness and she dies. And he's so outraged with Shiva that he commits himself every day to go to the top of Mount Kailash and throw a rock at the lingam, which is the altar of Shiva. And over the course of 8 years, he throws every rock on Mount Kailash until there are no rocks left. And so he takes his own head off, rips it off of his body and hurls it at the lingam. And in that moment, Shiva manifests, picks up the guy's body and he says, in what I think for some reason in a very Jewish accent, he says, "This one loved me." And my point there is these tortured souls that whose anger and whose rage and exasperation and frustration is expressed, its opposite has to be present. They couldn't be that passionate, they couldn't be that driven towards destruction if there wasn't some equal pain on the other side, some equal love on the other side of that hate. It was interesting listening to Dion, and I thought that was kind of a way in for me on Othello too. It was a very interesting idea that I had thought of when we were doing the play, but that this guy is a victim a little bit of, at times, it's an interesting perspective on it. He loves to tell stories and he loves to have his stories be heard. And there's quite an ego there. And when he talks about why he loved Desdemona, maybe he got carried away with that a little bit and he missed something. And, you know, because I always remember playing Iago, leaning on some column, listening to Keith do these beautiful verse speeches, being, "Well, man, this guy just loves to hear himself talk." And there was some truth in that for me as an actor, for myself, for the experience of the play, the Brechtian piece of it that I love, where I constantly want to be engaging the audience. How's this going? What do you guys think? That's the deliciousness of Iago. Are you seeing what I'm seeing? Because I think he's full of shit. You know, that's the beauty of Iago's soliloquies to me. Who's he that says I am a villain? You know, and that's not the exact line. I'll pull it if you want. I'll pull the text out later and get it right. It's been 20 years, but that speech, it was fun in the beginning to play as a mustache twirling speech. But the revelation for me was when you played it with the passion of conviction and truth. That I am loving him and destroying him, I am loving him. In destroying myself, I am doing what needs to be done. In allowing my hate to free itself from my breast and wreak havoc on the world, I'm doing it a service.
Well, what you raise, Liev, is one of the great mysteries of the character, which is that Iago, he's such a genius at plotting, and it doesn't seem to be for any larger reason that we can identify. He kills Emilia. He says, I am mum. I will not speak a word after this.
He gives a reason. He gives a reason. And, you know, not a lot of people generally tend not to invest in it, but I'll try to find the passage real quick.
Well, as you're looking, why don't we bring Whitney into the conversation? And actually, there's a question for you, Whitney. I know you were soliciting them. I want to hear what you have to say first, but maybe if you can fold this in. From Melanie, curious to learn as a student what your role and responsibilities were when you worked on Othello and how they were different as an associate director versus as a director in developing and realizing the production. So I think that's relevant.
That's a great question. Thank you for that question. I will certainly work it in because, and it's kind of the root of my response, to be honest. The tragedy of Othello is like this play that haunts me at every stage of my professional development as a theater maker. And I think it's very fascinating because I am obviously a Black woman, a Black female director. So when you say, oh, I love Shakespeare, I love classics, that's the one people expect you to want to direct. But I never particularly wanted to direct that play. It's because precisely many of the reasons that Dion brought up, it really does force the audience and all the artists working on the piece to look very deeply at the themes of the play. And it's very unfortunate to me that nearly every word in that play has deep significance to our current society today. The themes of racism, the themes of misogyny and marital abuse, to the very last lines that Othello says in the play, that he finds a turbaned Turk in Aleppo and smote him thus. And we have so much kind of unrest in the Middle East. And it's always kind of a very disturbing thing to me how congruent the piece remains to our times today. And so it's funny that the first time I worked on the play, I was an associate to Sam Gold on a beautiful production at the New York Theater Workshop. And that was a very interesting experience. And I told myself, oh, okay, I'm done with this. I got it, because it brings things up in you when you're working on it. And then I directed the play at Trinity Repertory Company with the company members. And the difference in working on it as an associate and a director were profound, because it was like going from it was like as an associate, I had an intellectual understanding of the piece. And in fact, that was my role, to just make sure the piece and the text stayed grounded and was executed a certain way. And then when I was directing it, all of a sudden, the play was like in my body and was made very real to me in this intense way. And it was a very emotional process for us all, because I was working with a company of actors that had a lot of familial love. I mean, my Emilia and Iago were married in real life, and there were real consequences all of a sudden to doing the play. And in fact, my master acting teacher was in the play, and I'm younger than him, and I'm telling him how this goes. So there were all these kind of systems of power that the play like naturally uprooted. It being a predominantly white cast, me being a Black director, people being married in the play, and you feel like, I was joking earlier before we started this talk, I was like, I hope people ask questions because I'm an agent of chaos. But that play is an agent of chaos, and every time I work on it, it kind of just shakes my soda can a different way. And so now I'm actually working on the piece again through a commission through American Repertory Theater. And this time we're turning it into a concert that's set to like Nirvana and The Doors, and it's interesting, like looking at it a musical lens. And anyways, all this is to say, like, every time I step in a different seat or kind of creative position with the text, it brings up different things. But this question that Drew has of love and hate is particularly relevant to me, because I think love and hate are ideas that are defined differently depending on what society you're in and the circumstances of that society. And if you look at the circumstantial world of Othello, we're looking at a militaristic society. We're looking at a world that knows war more than it knows peace. We're looking at a world and cast and play that is overpopulated with men. We're looking at war culture. We're looking at brotherhood. We're looking at the army. We're looking at these codes that exist within men when they're in a circle, when they're together. And so when I ask myself, okay, how does love and hate work in the play? I have to ask myself, well, how does love and hate work in that kind of circumstantial world? And my personal current analysis of the play, and it changes every time I'm working on it, but currently, I think I feel quite strongly that the only love that can exist in a world with those circumstances is a male type of love between men. And so this thing that Liev and Dion are talking about whether or not Othello really knows Desdemona, and this passage that Dion brought up actually is my favorite passage I was going to read as well. It's kind of where you want to take your intermission break. It's like halfway through the piece and Iago is on his knees. He says to this man, I am your own forever. And I swear those are the most romantic words uttered in the piece, I think. And so I'm like, okay, if heterosexual love between a male and female or within a marriage is kind of an empty symbol and the only real symbol of love is between men, then where do we go from there? And the play takes us to very scary places. I think it's interesting that when they're dropped in Cyprus, we're in this kind of French endgamey purgatorial space where everyone is reduced to their most base selves. And it is in that situation where you really see what everyone is made of, the men and the women. And the first thing that happens when they're there, because of Iago's gulling and because of the tools Iago uses, that the men immediately grab onto each other. And I don't know, my mother's always telling me, you really see who you are when you're in a situation that reduces you to your base self. And that's what Cyprus does. It reduces the characters to their base selves. And what do the men do when they are reduced, you know, by stress, by drink, by a war that didn't happen, and all this energy that's pent up that never gets released? Is they come to each other and they are each other's counsel and they rile each other up. And so I think the strongest, you know, this monologue I'm giving you is all to say that I think the play is a very interesting look at masculine love, if there is such a thing. And those are triggering terms, I think, in many ways, but they're useful terms for me. So that's kind of where I land on it. Yeah.
Amazing. I think we have a bunch of questions that I want to get to from James, and I think they're picking up on all these themes that we've introduced. How big a part of Othello's tragedy is his discomfort with life in peacetime? Like Coriolanus, Othello seems more comfortable at war than he is in peace when we see him in Act 1, really, in Venice. Could this be why he is so vulnerable to Iago's plot? Another question from Margot that's one of the fascinating riddles of the play is the marriage between Desdemona and Othello ever consummated? Is Shakespeare writing here about the fear of being cuckolded? Is Othello's reputation for masculinity what is at risk? Another question from Barbara S. Iago is a bastard. This is more of a comment, really. And my old professors of Shakespeare always said that Iago was the only Shakespeare character who was purely evil. Care to comment on that? So I wonder if we could maybe address those. Wartime versus peacetime, the consummation of the marriage of Desdemona and Othello, and Iago, is it useful to think of him as purely evil or not? Which I think we've already talked a little bit about. Dion, you look like you have some thoughts.
I think there is a case to be made that Othello is more comfortable. His entire realm of experience, especially when he's speaking with the Senate, has been in war, and so this period of time in the Venetian society, and this sort of period before they resend him off on a new campaign, I think is new for him, and has allowed for him to fall in love and express that side of himself. But I think it's not only a new side of him to explore. He's also in a society that's not his own, which is why I think Cassio has both Cassio and Othello, but Cassio is reported as having gone between them quite often in their relationship, has been a means for Othello to understand Desdemona, to understand when, is she angry at me? What does she mean when she said this? What's this? What do I do here? I think he's, in my imagining, had that assistance from Cassio. And so once Cassio is removed out of the picture, he no longer has that stability. And that's why I think Iago is then able to supplant and kind of work on him. So then we're in Cyprus, and we're in a world that's familiar to Othello. And I think that's able to sort of overtake him. So I think there is a case there that he's more comfortable in that war world. He knows that war world. He doesn't know this world of love. And once his stability in it is undermined, then it's easy for him to go to what he knows.
I'm muted. You also have Desdemona insisting to go with Othello to Cyprus. So she is removing herself from a domestic private context and putting herself into a military world where she is outnumbered. And on the question of the marriage being consummated, I think it's Act 2, Scene 3, where Cassio gets drunk in the middle of the night and gets into a fight, which is the first night of Desdemona and Othello's honeymoon. And Othello shows up with his sword out and is very agitated and angry because he's being denied the conjugal rights of a man.
That's how I'd imagined it in the production that we did, because you could play it either way, but I feel that being denied and that tension between them makes it easier for him to start to really go off the handle when he considers, well, we haven't got there yet. And I thought that what we were building to was something pure and something new. But if she's been sleeping with other people, then I don't know who she is. I don't know what this is. So I think by making the decision to not have them had their marriage rights and have their first night together and have that actually be interrupted by the brawl, creates a problem and an internal tension inside of Othello.
Liev, you were looking for a passage that you wanted to illustrate earlier. I wonder if it's appropriate now or.
No, you know it. It's the one where he says, what is it? It's I stand account for us. The more, howbeit, that I endure him not, as of a constant, loving, noble nature, and I dare think he'll prove to Desdemona a most dear husband. Now, I do love her too, not out of absolute lust, though peradventure I stand accounted for his greatest sin, but partly led to die at my revenge, for that I do suspect the lusty Moor hath leaped into my seat, the thought whereof doth like a poisonous mineral gnaw my innards, and nothing can or shall content my soul till I am even with him wife for wife. So he suggests that he thinks Othello slept with Amelia, his wife. Now that is neither here nor there, but Barbara, Edmund is actually the bastard, and your English teacher may be right, but I don't think I want to see his production of Othello.
Wow.
But there is, in that speech, picking up on what Dion was saying, there is this obsession with Desdemona, who's described in the last scene of having skin as smooth as alabaster. There's a great deal made out of her whiteness. And in the first scene, Iago says some sort of hateful lines about an old black ram tupping your white ewe. There's this obsession with the sexual union between Othello and Desdemona, this commingling of white and black, which makes this question about whether or not the marriage is consummated a really important one in the play, because it would mean a successful integration of Othello into society, which he very much seems to want at the beginning of the play. He wants to be Venetian, unlike Shylock, who wants nothing to do with real Christian Venetians. He's a member of Venetian society, but he's also a self-defined outsider. Whereas the tragedy of Othello, in some ways, is he wants to be an insider, and there are all these forces in the play pushing him to the outside, or pushing him to be other, defining him as other. And I think sexuality is a huge part of that. You mentioned Emilia. We haven't really talked about Emilia yet. And there was a question about her. Are we Emilia? Barry asks. Emilia is a good person, a good friend to Desdemona. Emilia tries to live a moral life. However, Emilia is the one who gave Iago the handkerchief, which, as we know, does not end well for anybody. Are we, on some level, Emilia? Whitney.
I think I find Emilia very fascinating. And this third time that I'm going at this play, I'm actually trying to position the whole play around Emilia. But I think it's really interesting that in the questions, these terms of good and evil come up. Is Iago evil? Emilia is good. And I guess in terms of my analysis of the play, because this is not a kingdom play, as Drew says, this is not about kings and queens. This is not about magic fairies in a forest like in MIDSUMMER. This is about people on the ground living their lives. And as we all know, people can be both good and bad. And so for me, in my analysis of the play, I think that no one is good, especially Othello. And so when no one is good, the ideas of good and evil kind of go away from me. And so then I'm really like curious about the ugly interpersonal relationships and kind of complications that arise. So it's like, I don't think Emilia is good, but I do think she is as close to me, and I'll say me as in like a citizen of the now, a human of the now, or us, the audience. I think she's as close to us as possible. She witnesses a lot of the play. She makes a series of decisions that lead to very dire consequences. And why I love positioning Emilia as us, as the people of the now, is that, it's like, what was that one white lie you told that kind of wrought havoc on your life? And I think she's a really interesting study of what happens when you don't speak up. And we're in this political time right now, and we're all learning so many new things that are new for some of us and not new for others of us, because people are speaking up about it. And she's a very interesting portrait of like, when do you act? When do you speak up when something is wrong? When do you put it all together, and when do you risk your own life for a common good? So she is this kind of very contemporary symbol of humanity to me, because she messes it up, right? She doesn't speak up when she should, and we all mess it up. So I guess, yes, she is kind of the audience for me in my analysis of it, but she's not good. Nobody's good. And I would argue that Othello himself also is not good. I don't know if there's any goodness in the play.
And the goodness to my mind is that is the human condition. How flawed they are, how deeply wounded, how in extreme pain they are, is part of A, what makes him such a great writer, and B, such a brilliant comment on our humanity. And that's why I always love those last lines of the Iago's that were so baffling to everybody else, because it's almost Brechtian. I mean, it is Brechtian. It's almost, by that I mean it's almost editorial. He says, "Demand me nothing." When they're all standing around him going, "Oh my God, what you did! Why did you do what you do?" He goes, "Demand me nothing. What you know, you know. From this time forth, I never will speak word." Which is, you know exactly why I did what I did, because you do it too. It's in you. The pain, all of it exists in all of us. Don't question, don't blame me. I'm not it's in you. My pain is your pain. It's shared. And you know what? If you're gonna do it like, then I'm never gonna speak again. Because I've always been the outsider, and I will continue to be the outsider. And the more of that pain I feel, the more destruction I cause. So there's nothing you can do but stick a blade in my heart right now, which you've done. So maybe that'll work if you're lucky.
I love that. I love that line, "What you know, you know." For the same.
You know. We all know the truth.
In other words, it may be flattering for the audience to think of themselves as Emilia, but we are also, in a real way, Iago, and we are seeing the play through his lens.
And Othello.
And Othello.
What I wonder about is Desdemona. Is where is Desdemona's place in this? You could say that every character is complicit, and every character, the ugliness of what they do and don't do, what they take for granted, comes up, and I wonder about Desdemona, because she really seems to be an innocent blown in the wind. Where is her culpability in this?
That's her
story?
culpability. An innocent blowing in the wind.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, at least from
it's not enough to be an innocent in this world. It's not enough to not.
She's put her whole world is built around this man. Her whole consciousness, her whole life, is built around this romantic notion of love. Well, I mean, there's a million different ways to interpret it. And that's a beautiful thing, I guess, at some level. But when you look at it from the very painful and cynical perspective of someone like Iago, it's like, what a waste of your time to build your life around someone else who could never possibly be worth your trust, because no one is worth your trust. And she, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a very painful statement for someone to make, but we've all made it somewhere in our hearts.
And what's also interesting about Desdemona is she defies her father. She runs off with this much older man. She inserts herself. She speaks up in front of the Senate of Venice, which takes a lot of courage. She intervenes on behalf of Cassio. In some ways, she's the most feminist of Shakespeare's characters. She's often played in this kind of Victorian romanticized way, but she is constantly trying to negotiate with men on men's terms, which also turns out kind of tragically for her in the play.
Whitney,
And
I'd love to hear your response to that. Is Desdemona the most feminist of all Shakespeare?
Oh, Simon, see you guys, he saw me behind the scenes make like a face, like I disagree with that statement. And then he like is making me talk. I think that, all right. I think that when you really start to look at the economic kind of breakdown of the play, when you start to look at a young woman who is, you know, a very well-positioned, wealthy woman, very rich household, very powerful father, when you start to look at the socioeconomics of who's up here, and Othello kind of overleaps his station in life to get in that, and then you have Iago and Emilia down here as these like grunts. I think when I personally start to look at that way the economics are, the characters are stratified within the play, I start to see some very unlikable qualities in Desdemona. I'll get to the feminist thing in a minute, but I start to see someone who is maybe a little entitled. I start to see someone who does flirt back with Iago when they land on the beach and he's telling her those jokes. And Amelia's just sitting there, there holding her bags. You know what I mean? I start to see someone who's used to having a handmaiden. I don't know if any of you out there have ever been a handmaiden, but it's like a servant, right? I start to see someone who ignores Emilia, who's dismissive to Emilia, who flirts with Emilia's husband. And then I get a portrait of a human that I know, because I do think all these characters are human. There is no deus ex machina in this play. There is no godlike character in this play, and there is no savior. And I think even Desdemona shows these kind of entitled white characteristics that you can enter if you choose to. And so the idea of her being a feminist, I think it's a really fascinating statement that Drew said. And I think the women, both of them, ultimately, there is a sort of feminism, if you want to call it that, in the play, because the women are trying to speak their truths, right? Albeit maybe a little too late, definitely too late, because they don't survive the play, you guys. But whether or not she's the most feminist character, I don't know. I don't know if it's possible to be that in the play. But again, when I go back to, it's like what Liev said, like no one is good and no one is bad. It's all in there. You know, if you try and look at Desdemona that way, you'll probably find some good juice. She's not a perfect dove, you know what I mean? So those are my thoughts in response to that.
I think that's one theme that keeps on coming up in tonight's conversation, is that these characters are never just one thing. And that especially in this play, gender and class and race feel very modern, and they feel like they intersect in all these complicated ways. We have a question for you, Dion, from Paul, about the journey that playing Othello takes an actor on. It must be difficult to portray. You've touched a bit on it already, but I remember seeing Avery Brooks as Othello, Patrick Page as Iago, and thinking that, well, he's editorializing now about the quality of the performances, but how do you as an actor manage to portray the significant changes Othello goes through and do it day in and day out and not be completely exhausted and drained after every show?
When I played Othello at the Stratford Festival, this was in 2014, if I'm remembering right, it was in rep. So I didn't have to perform the show every single day, which was a blessing, because I could go away, let myself emotionally heal, physically recharge, and come back and pour myself into it. But what I did find about the role, and one thing I worked with my director on it was just this fine balance, because you always have to ask yourself, why don't they have a direct and clear, rational conversation? Why does that never happen in the play? And it's very easy, especially because Iago really has the first half of the play with direct address to the audience. He's funny, he's witty, he's able to establish a connection with them and get them onto his side of thinking. That as Othello, I had to work really hard to not give in to the momentous emotions, the wave of rage, the bombastic, size of what his emotion becomes. I had to resist that, to fight that, so that I could keep the audience on his journey for as long as possible. It's going to end terribly. You know where it's going, but it's very easy for the audience to turn out and go, I don't accept that. I can't see why he didn't have a conversation with her, and I'm not on board with him. And I think he's an idiot to be fooled like that. So I work to play Othello from the standpoint of he's constantly resisting that emotion that's bubbling up, and he's always trying to act from a rational, discerning place, always trying to make sure he has all of the facts in the situation. And even when it looks like things have gone so far and Desdemona won't even confess the truth to him, it doesn't turn into a blind rage to kill her. It comes from a loving attempt to, at the very least, save her soul. And even though it's all distorted and messed up in his mind, all of his actions are coming from love. And so it was a tightrope walking that, because in the end you do have to the emotion has to overtake you. But you can't, as an actor, enjoy the feeling of what that is. You can never enjoy getting upset. You can never enjoy doing what it is that you have to do. It's the last thing that you want to do.
I just want to speak in support of that, Dion, if I may, and actually lots of things that have come up about it. It reminds me when I was doing a Strange Interlude, the Eugene O'Neill play, where of course there's a lot of suffering. And my assistant director said to me one day, you know what, Simon, maybe it's helpful to remember that human beings are always trying to move away from pain. Mm-hmm. And this feeling that you describe of, I am searching for what's going to help me, help everyone right now, is very energizing and very true, I think. Even though we end up doing terrible things, we feel tragically that we're trying to help. And I suppose the other thing is that with Liev, speaking of Iago, and we were saying, Dion, that of course it's very important that Iago is persuasive. Because if he's not, we think Othello is, as you say, not smart. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a much more intense and unbearable situation when everybody is perilously convincing, because it makes everyone else smarter, and therefore us smarter, and also us more vulnerable for that, I think. So I just wanted to kind of speak to those excellent points.
Yeah, that's resisting those two verse speeches at the top of Act 1 is really smart. I wish I had seen that production. That's super interesting way to keep the audience's attention, because everyone's expecting that bombastic big number there in Act 1, and to sort of hold that back a little bit is a really compelling way to save the fireworks between the two of them for the second act. I wish I'd seen that. Sounds really good.
Maybe a slightly, well, I think it's a controversial question, but from Michael, how do the dynamics and perceptions change if there is a reversal of casting? For example, at STC, when Patrick Stewart played Othello in the quote-unquote photo-negative production. And we were talking about this a little bit before we went on air.
Well, I think it's probably quite tricky because none of us saw that production. Well, I don't think so, unless maybe we did. I didn't, because it was before I arrived in Washington. Did Liev, Dion, Whitney? I don't think anyone saw it. So I think it's quite hard to tell, really. I mean, my gut tells me that the description Dion has given to us this evening, which for me has been an incredible learning about how things speak and feel and look as being so central to the play's meaning, that I couldn't imagine myself as a director making that decision. But maybe others, yeah, I don't know whether Whitney would want to speak to that.
Well, I think it's fascinating, right? Because this might be a little reductive, but when I really enter the possibility of directing a production with reverse ethnicity in terms of casting, what that production becomes in my mind is kind of a social justice statement, right? Because we are reversing the roles of these men to put a white actor, male or female, in a situation that they are not in our modern world, right? And by placing the other, kind of by upsetting that casting, what we do is we see a white man go through an experience that you would not see in real life, right? And so it might produce empathy or understanding and kind of work as a way to speak, to kind of have a statement like, now do you see, or something like that. So I understand it kind of from a like social justice or a way to try and bring empathy and understanding, racial understanding in the audience. But I too, for better or for worse, am committed to the original way of doing it in terms of an ethnic breakdown, because it is the world, we live in a world in which that circumstance is possible. And because it is so congruent to, you know, what we go through, the way our society is organized, I'm like, I need to interrogate it as is, because it presents unfortunate truths that we need to try and unlock or understand or work past, or like Simon says, move away from that pain. But I truly only understand the play in its kind of original intent, for better or for worse. I think it's a really interesting exercise, and it's a worthy exercise, but it is a fantasy in this weird way, and somehow doing it as the way it's originally intended is less of a fantasy to me.
Right, it's a kind of a utopian gesture, a wishful thinking that we can reverse race, which of course you can't. You can try to cancel race in a production or neutralize it, but there's no such thing as actually erasing race and racism, as we've learned.
Or erasing our understandings of it, because race is a construct, it's not a real thing. So it's like, what we're doing is we're looking at our embedded understandings of something, and those are the things that we indeed have to try to change, you know?
I've always felt, you know, awkward about stunty things like that. But then, you know, I've seen some really extraordinary gender reversal productions, and then you kind of hear things in a way that you never heard it before. I think it's a little obviously cringy when you get into a play like Othello, but you never know. It's you know, sometimes with this language, I remember when I was doing Hamlet, I was so excited to do Hamlet, and when I looked out at the first two rows of the theater, and there was this group of people who would be reading along with me, and it used to drive me nuts. And I thought, okay, well, maybe in a gender swapped production or a racial swap, suddenly you have to hear something differently. You have to see something differently. You get to know the play too well, and it shakes it up. It's nothing that it's not my thing. I think particularly Othello, particularly Merchant of Venice, these are plays that are about a type of person who doesn't belong where they are, and that has such resonance in our society now that it feels odd to go the other way around. More often than not, it feels like some guy wanted to play Othello, unfortunately. But they do have interesting ways of making you hear the play new. Certainly some of those Cheek by Jowl productions.
Right, the brilliant Declan Donnellan in Cheek by Jowl, who's famous for, I think he did an all-male As You Like It. That was one of the early queer productions of a Shakespeare play. Well, this has been the Shakespeare Hour. We are at time. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Next week, we will actually continue this discourse about the outsider and insider. We will be discussing The Merchant of Venice. Our guests include F. Murray Abraham, Jeffrey Horowitz from Theater for a New Audience, and more, which we will be announcing shortly. Simon, do we have time for a quick update with the Phoenix Fund?
Oh, well, to be honest, I don't think I can. I'm really extraordinarily moved tonight. Thank you. I actually feel so, I can't speak really to say that I've really held the thoughts and the generosity of the speakers tonight and the passion that we've all spoken. And I just want to say thank you. Thanks you guys for giving up your hour. Thanks for everyone that's listening and tuning in. Together we're talking about Shakespeare and it feels like it's a help. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. And if we didn't answer your question, we will be answering those on Friday via email. So we will answer all the questions. All right, good night, everyone.